Hi, my name is Christian Sparks. You may know me online as Hippo Wombat. I'm the creator of Orbit Weather and Season Suite, and today I'm going to show you how to get started with it. I'm going to be using the 4.13 release version. We're going to go ahead and, rather than opening up the example project that you're going to get when you purchase this either through Gumroad or the Unreal Engine Marketplace when it's on there, I'm going to actually show you how to implement it into your own project, since, more often than not, that's what I wanted to do when I bought new assets. So I'm going to launch Unreal Engine 4.13. We're just going to make a brand new project and bring Orbit in. So I'm just going to go with the first person template. I am not going to do starter content. That doesn't affect anything with Orbit. I just don't feel like messing around with that. So there's a little bit of preparation that needs to be done, but setup time is pretty short, thankfully. So I'm just going to Alt-P and make sure everything's working as it's supposed to. That's really loud, wow. That's a little better. Okay, so I'm going to go into Settings and World Settings. We're going to head over to Light Mass and tick this little Force No Pre-Computed Lighting. That's going to make all lighting dynamic. We're not going to be baking any light maps or anything like that. And that is a requirement for Orbit to work, since all the lighting is totally dynamic. So we've ticked that. We're going to build lighting one time. And it's done. That's the end of that. Now I'm going to go ahead and save and close my project. What I'm going to do next, instead of using Unreal Engine 4's built-in migrate feature, I've come across a few issues with that. It doesn't tend to keep the file structure or the folder structure the way it's supposed to. So instead, I'm going to bring in my 4.13 release. When you download this may be in your downloads folder, wherever it is. I unzipped it to a folder called Orbit 4.13 release. So Orbit 4.13 is here. I'm going to take the content folder, which has Orbit right here. And actually, I'll just go ahead and copy the Orbit folder, and then I'm going to head over into my projects and Orbit tutorial content, and I'm just going to paste that whole Orbit folder right there, and that's going to maintain all of the folder structures needed, so that nothing within the main blueprint is unassigned in terms of meshes, materials, struct references, stuff like that. And real quick here, you're going to notice that directional light isn't casting any shadows. That's because we're not baking any light maps, and these lights are set to stationary. So we're going to set this to movable. Now it's going to start casting shadows. Same with skylight, movable. We're going to want to add one more light, one more directional light. Set this to movable as well, and we can name this Moon. One last piece of setup before I actually drop the blueprint in is I'm going to go to Project Settings, go to Rendering under Engine, and we're going to tick Generate Mesh Distance Fields as true. This is for the weather cover culling and the weather particles culling. So weather particles in this system are fully physicalized, so they don't pass through solid objects, but they rely on the creation and maintaining of the mesh distance fields. I'm going to go ahead and tick this as true, and it's going to ask me to restart. We'll save the level. Okay, project settings are still open. We don't need them anymore. Okay. So we have these awesome distance field blobs. We can go ahead and turn off cast shadows for the skylight. That's going to get those away, but we're still going to be able to have those mesh distance fields generated, so that we can still use them with the blueprint. So now we are good to delete the SkySphere blueprint. I'm also going to delete the atmospheric fog actor, because the system does not use it. I'm going to add in an exponential height fog, because the system does use that. And we're going to go into the orbit, blueprints, and drop this guy in here. Okay, so orbit's there, but nothing's happened yet. That's because we need to assign the actors to orbit. So we need to do the sun actor was the light source originally. Moon actor is moon. That's going to generate the light from the moon mesh. The skylight actor obviously is the skylight. Height fog actor is the exponential height fog, and the post-process volume. This is for the seasonal color grading. You don't have to use that, but we do have to assign all the actors here. So we're good to go there. So now it still kind of looks like nothing's going on. That's because none of the settings have been updated. So if I scroll down through, and we'll go over all these settings here, but I'm going to scroll down to weather pattern, and we'll just load the sunny weather pattern. So you can select from any of these weather patterns to load. I'm going to just start, it'll start with lightly cloudy, so that generates the clouds as well. And then we're just going to hit load. And here's orbit. So real quick here, there's a couple more pieces of setup that we need to do. First off, you'll notice the clouds are super flat. We'll get to that in a second. But before we do that, we need to assign the cloud shadow material to the directional light actors. So we're going to do light source, and we're going to have a look at the light function. So if you go under your blueprint, or your orbit folder, excuse me, under materials, there's m_cloud shadows. Just going to drag this guy over to the light function material, and that's going to start generating those cloud shadows, but we need to set up the scale properly. So if I just start cranking this up here, and you know what, the density is probably not going to allow for them to be seen right now. So if you go to blueprint, orbit, and you go to cloud density and turn it up a little bit, you can see that it's starting to get darker now. That's because those cloud shadows are being applied. But we're going to head back to the light source actor now that those are being applied, and we can kind of scale the mapping for these cloud shadows. And they're really dark right now. Again, that's something that we're going to set up here. So I'm going to set those up, fade distance. That's another thing that, if you have a really large level, you can crank that up, obviously. Anyway, so we have that for that one, and we're also going to do it for the moon. So starting off, I'll come back to volumetric fog actors. So backdrop clouds. I'm going to untick render stratus clouds for now. So backdrop clouds are rendered on a single layer. They're not necessarily volumetric. They're more just like a card, essentially, in the background. So there's 3 different styles that you can choose from going in. I typically stick with cirrocumulus. And then you can set the height in the world that the backdrop is going to be at. You can set the scale. And you can set the opacity and the brightness. Backdrop color. However, you can actually set the backdrop colors to change with the time of day. That setting's under stratus clouds because it's just targeting all clouds in general. And then this is going to set it to auto-rotate the backdrop sheet. So at runtime, it'll run on a timer, and it'll just, depending on the speed that you set it at, it'll spin this similar to the Skysphere blueprint, just to give it a little bit more motion so that it's not just this big flat cloudscape that it kind of is by itself. So moving away from backdrop clouds, we're going to come into stratus clouds, which is one of the bigger features in Orbit. So I'm going to tick render stratus clouds as true. I'm just going to bring those back. There's a bunch of different sample qualities. Low is going to be for lower range hardware in general. Medium is kind of the go-to for game design in general across all ranges of hardware. This is definitely not a lightweight system. This is very performance intensive as you start scaling the features up. And the main reason for that is transparency overdraw, which I'll get into a little bit here. But anyway, cloud sampling. So I'm going to keep it with medium for now. You can kind of play around with the sampling and see what you like. You can mess with the source texture for the clouds. I'm going to leave that alone for now as well. That's really more for changing how you want your clouds to appear. You can apply a stylized texture if you're going for like a toon style game. That's the main reason that I expose that as a parameter. So by default, the pattern that I chose sets this parameter to be true, that it's going to lock the cloud colors to the time of day, and that's going to apply it to the backdrops as well. And then you have the option to desaturate the sky color with the cloud intensity. So that is going to, if you look through the gaps in the clouds here, as I increase the cloud density or decrease it, it changes the saturation with it. I'm going to disable that, but it is there if you want it. So the first thing that I'm going to do, unless you have a really varied, on the Z scale of your game, a really varied height difference in different areas in your level or your world space, the 360,000 height that I have this set to should be okay. Again, that's why it's exposed. If it's not, you can go ahead and edit it. The render distance is going to be the distance from the camera that the clouds are going to be rendering on their sheets. The shape fall off I'll get into in a second here, because it's really more dependent on the fluffiness, which is what we're going to mess with now. So the clouds look super flat right now. That's because the samples that are rendering the clouds are compressed super close together. They're not fluffy at all. So we want to increase the space between the samples. So to do that, you're just going to take your fluffiness value and slide it up. That's going to give those clouds a nice volume there. From there, real quick here, I am going to disable wind, and I'll get to wind in a second, so that we can take a look at the shape fall off without being distracted by the motion. So I don't know why I moved around there. So shape fall off, this is kind of dependent on the height of the clouds, but essentially it's going to take those edges where the textures are being drawn, and it's going to kind of cut them down exponentially down the Z height of the sample layers, and that kind of gives them a little bit of a rounded edge around the tops, just to kind of give them a little bit more of a shape rather than just a bunch of stacks of textures. Moving forward from there, the cloud lighting intensity is how bright the lit areas of the clouds are. You can go outrageous with it, that's all exposed. The backlighting exponent, so the self-shadowing on the clouds here, everything for the lighting on the clouds is from an unlit shader, and so everything is simulated for the lighting. So the backlighting exponent is going to take Z height on the sample layers and impose a self-shadowing rule based on whatever exponent you set here. So if I increase or decrease this, it's going to bring that self-shadowing level higher up into the clouds. This is all dependent on Z height. In the future, I'm going to be looking into making this compatible with spherical worlds, with the recent increase in interest in procedural planets thanks to No Man's Sky. Definitely something that we want to move away from for just Z height only. But then, anyway, if I move this up further, the exponent is going to pull that shader down the Z height of the clouds, and so you can have no shading at all, you can have a little bit, you can have a lot, you can have a whole lot. It's really the main focus of this system was customization, so you can do whatever you want to do. Before I move any further forward, just going parameter by parameter, everything is kind of already set up at this point. You can go through and change whatever values you want to change, but from this point the system is functional. I'm going to bring the wind exponent back up to 2 for north-south, and these are directionally accurate. I'm going to go, and I'm actually going to load a preset There's 6 presets available and then 6 custom slots. I'll get to that in a second here. So I'm going to do the automated preset. So this is going to allow for time of day to pass, for stratus cloud density to change based on probability, for weather to events to occur, to check and occur. So real quick here, let's head back up here. So time of day settings, whoops, right here. So by default it's set for 10 minutes. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to set it to half of a minute. So 30 seconds. So when I hop in here, move this out of the way. So cloud density already has changed once. You can set up the time difference between cloud density checks, and those are based on probability as well. And then now the sun has set and the night sky has appeared. We'll get a little bit further in here. It looks like night ambient lighting is set up pretty high. Something that you'll notice if you have time of day set to go past really quickly is that it'll look like the cloud shadows on the ground are flickering. That's a result of the sun projection moving along with the actual texture projection moving, and so it kind of messes with the speed a little bit. When it's at a reasonable amount for a realistic amount for a game like 10 minutes, it's not really something that's noticeable. When you're speeding it up, it's going to look unnatural, which is just how it would be if day were suddenly this short as well. So I'm going to hop out of the level there. So moving back up to clouds, because the stratus clouds are definitely the most complicated portions. Excuse me. Okay, so we have, oops. Oh no. Okay. So cloud density you can change. Crank it all the way up for full cloud coverage. Turn it down. If you're not going to be using, if you're not going to be changing this, you can untick this and it'll keep whatever density you choose at runtime, and it'll keep it indefinitely. Otherwise you can click this to true, and based on probability it will choose a random density between 0 and 1. And you can set the frequency for those checks to occur. By default it looks like it's set to 20 seconds. There's a cloud opacity value which doesn't take the density, it literally just affects the opacity of the clouds. You can mess with that however you want to. The cloud sheet scale, so these clouds are being projected onto a series of stacked sheet meshes. So I would have to go ridiculously far out. But if I go way down here, so you can see that there's definitely a shape here. You can take the sheet scale and increase it if you want to. The main issue with that is that these textures aren't world aligned. They are aligned to the mesh's UVs, so you will need to adjust the pattern scales as needed, which is literally the next one up here. So the cloud pattern scale, if you bring it down to 0.1. The cloud shadow pattern scale, so you can actually see that there's a little bit of a texturization of the shadows because everything's unlit. This is all pre-calculated in the shader, in the material, excuse me. Where am I? Here we go. The cloud shadow pattern scale, so you can decrease this and you can actually see that texture is being projected there, and it's all generated from the same texture. So you can assign that as you see fit. The cloud wind exponent is going to be how fast the main pattern moves based on the wind strength. So you can increase this. And it looks like I have it locked to 10. If you don't want it locked to 10, you can actually get into the blueprint and set the parameter ranges yourself, which is really easy to do. The cloud dissolve exponent is going to be the mapping scale for the texture that passes over the main texture pass to form these breakaways that you're seeing. So I can, if I decrease this, you're going to see a pattern forming because it's the texture being mapped over and over, just like that. Excuse me. And then the dissipation wind molt is the same thing as for the main texture pass. It's going to be how fast in reference to the wind strength that texture is going to be panning. The cloud cast shadows max render distance parameter, that's going to equate to when you click on your light source. And this fade distance, that's exactly what that sets. It's just everything's stored within the blueprint. Excuse me. Moving further down, cloud shadow power, so that's going to be the contrast of the shadows being cast down. Excuse me. The sun lighting fall off. So where is my level here? Over here. So I dropped it into the, okay. Bring this here. So when I have the sun where it is, if I slow down the wind, you can see that this section right here is backlit up on the higher z-axis of the clouds. That backlighting is all simulated, but it's actually controllable through these sun lighting parameters under the volumetric stratus clouds. So I can increase the intensity of just those areas, and by comparison I can turn them completely off, and now everything is lit exactly the same, in case you couldn't tell the difference before. You can do the radius, so this is all masked based on the sun position, so I can increase the radius of this, and it's going to affect more sections down below here, whereas if I crank it way back down, you're not going to be able to see it as well. Okay, so we're going to leave it at what it was. The offset is going to be the z height, excuse me, that the backlighting is going to occur at, the threshold for that. So if I move this parameter, oops, move the other way. The higher up that I move it, it's going to affect higher portions. I'm going to back this back up to where it was. So if I, yeah, anyway. And then that's the same for the moonlighting fall off intensity radius offset. Real quick here, if I set the time of day. So moving forward, we're going to take a look at the moon and the way that it affects the backlighting as well, approaching the last few pieces of the way that the stratus clouds are rendered. So my moon is lit up right now. Yours may not be when you start off. If it's not, you'll want to check the moon phase and see what it's at. 0, 0, or 1, 0 are going to be totally covered. If I hop above the clouds here real quick, you can see that the moon actually does have a functioning phase. That phase also affects the way that it lights the world and the clouds. So, whoops, going a little too fast there. Okay, so the moon phase will actually affect the cloud backlighting and the overall lighting of the world. So anyway, we're at a full moon here. If we go back up and take a look at the moon lighting intensity for the stratus clouds, you can crank that up and turn it down, and you can kind of see how it's affecting the clouds themselves. The same thing can be done with lightning. I'm not going to go through that just because lightning, setting it up to not flash for just a second like lightning does, is going to be a little bit counterproductive. But the values are essentially the same thing that you're going to do here. Finally, we have cloud light and dark color. So the light color is going to be the top half of the z-axis. The dark color is going to be the shaded color. So the bottom half on the z-axis of the samples. Those again by default are set to change with the time of day. If you want to change how they look during the time of day, you're going to want to look in this curves folder, and there's all sorts of curves, but for this particular one you're going to want to look for cloud dark color and cloud light color. So setting things back to time of day, we have our wind settings. Wind north and south, so positive values are going to equate to north. You can see that it's going to blow it this way. Negative values are going to equate to south. And then same with east and west. East. So I guess it's actually east positive, west negative, and south positive. Nope. North positive, south positive. Well, that's a little bit confusing, and I apologize for that. That'll be something that I might have to look into fixing. The wind weight and the wind speed are going to apply for like foliage assets that use the material function for snow rain for foliage. So snow and rain buildup in this system are controlled by the blueprint, and then they affect the materials via these exposable or exposed functions. I'll get to that. I'll set that up for one of these materials, just one of the base ones here. And the foliage is more or less the same. If you have a basic understanding of how to work with foliage in Unreal Engine 4, then you'll be able to figure it out for sure. Moving on to time of day. This is a 0 to 2400 value. It's going to represent midnight. 1200 is noon. 880 is, or 850 is 8:30. 1450 is 2:30. Really basic. You can also do set it to the system time. So if you look down in the corner here, I'm at 11:02 p.m. So I'm going to click set system time or use system time, and then at runtime, it's going to grab my system time and apply it to the game. And then it's going to actually simulate the game at a 1:1 speed with real time, which is handy if you're doing like simulation, or if you just want to see how that looks. Typically I don't use that, but it was a requested feature. You can also set whether or not it's going to simulate time of day at runtime. So 12:11, shadows aren't moving, sun's not moving, it's going to stay this time indefinitely. Or you can set the day length to be like 0.1 simulate, and it is going to go super fast. Alternatively, you can set it to 10, which is the default. That's 10 minutes. So each incremental value of 1 equates to 1 minute. So moving on to the moon, I'm going to set it back to nighttime so that we can see this a little better. So the moon lighting level is going to be how much the moon affects lighting in the world. 0.050, we can set it to not do anything at all. The distance from the Earth is going to be how far from the Earth the moon mesh is going to be. The moon is actually mesh based, so if I bring this in super close, you are looking at the moon mesh. So the orbital pitch and orbital angle. So the orbital angle here is going to control where the moon is in relation to its rotation around the planet. And then the orbital pitch is going to change the slope for that, essentially. The moon brightness is going to be how bright the actual moon mesh is, and that also increases its effect on the clouds. So it's kind of important to correlate the two of those. Excuse me, jeez. The moon physical rotation is going to take the actual rotation of the moon mesh. So right now, the way that you're looking at it, if you look at the system, there is a spring arm attached to a spring arm, and that's how it's going to generate all of its math for slope versus orbit versus rotation. That keeps all of those separate. So you can actually tweak this and mess around with the way that the moon is rotating with its face, or the moon mesh itself, etc. The moon color, which is tied to the sun position, but if I untick that, I can make the moon red or whatever, and it's bright right now with the texture, so it's not actually going to change the color, but it's going to change the color of the lighting, and that affects the clouds as well. I don't want to do that for my particular system, so I'm going to uncheck that. The moon phase, which we went over, is going to be where the moon is phased at based on its self-rotation on its own axis. The moon phase darkness is another parameter that you can set. So I usually have it pretty high, but if you set the moon phase so that you can actually see it, you can control how dark that self-shadowing is. You can automate the moon phase at runtime. That is day by day. So it, by default, takes 30 days to phase through. If you want to change that, that's not an exposed parameter, but you can go in and change the integer value in the blueprint. If you guys have questions on how to do that, you can email me. I don't think I'm going to make a tutorial specifically for that just because it's kind of a niche thing. Moon, let's see, render moon rays, whether or not it's going to render those sweet directional light shafts. Well, yeah, you get the idea. Ow, go away. Okay. The moon rays intensity, so you can crank up the the value just like you would with the directional light actor. I'm not gonna mess with those. The visibility through the atmosphere is a cool feature. By default, 412 had an issue with setting default struct values, and so this was kind of an issue setting the default to load from a pattern. But you can set it manually, regardless of whether or not it's tied to whether or not the moon color is tied to the sun position. Excuse me. So, like you can set what the atmosphere color is on the moon itself. So let's say it's pink. We're gonna take this moon phase back. So now you can see that the atmosphere is actually affecting the way that we see the surface of the moon from where we're at. You can also, you can set how visible it is from through the atmosphere. On a 0 to 1 or a 0.5 to 1 scale. I usually set it to something a little bit more of a natural blue color, and then you can kind of tweak it as needed. But so yeah, that's available as well. Moving on to the sky, I'm going to set this back to daytime. So here we are. Maybe a little bit more of an angle. Cool. Okay. So the sky. Again, you can lock the colors to the time of day, or you can unlock them and you can set them to be whatever the heck you want. You can set your sky to be super orange if that's what you're into. Or you can just lock it to the time of day again, and you can flip those back and forth super easily. The horizon height and fall off, and the zenith height and fall off. So the horizon is going to be right smack dab in the center. If I turn off backdrop clouds and stratus clouds, the color gradient between the two is kind of noticeable, but if I do like horizon fall off and tweak this, you can see the color difference here. And that fall off sharpens between the horizon and the meridian. And then it does the same thing for between the meridian and the zenith, which is the top portion, if you didn't know. You can sharpen that zenith value. The sky opacity, so how opaque the sky is, doesn't really change a whole lot. Just because of the way that it's rendered. And then you can set the brightness overall to be however you want it. Real quick here, never mind. Actually, you know what? That doesn't matter. Okay, moving on. So stars. You can lock the stars' visibility to the time of day. You can unlock it as well and make the stars visible whenever you want. So you can set the stars' visibility to 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, 100. Just kidding. You can only do it to 1, whether or not it's visible. You can do a pattern scaling. I'm going to set this to night just so that it's a little bit easier. It makes sense that stars aren't visible during the day. Okay, so there's your stars. That's on another sheet. It's projecting that texture, so you can do the pattern scale, change it to be however you want, bigger stars, tinier stars, whatever you like. You can do the star sheet scale itself, so if you have a pretty big world, you can crank this guy up to be even higher, and then map the star pattern a little bit differently so that you can actually see the stars. I'm going to leave that alone. The star map contrast. So the default star map that I included has a very high concentration of white dots. But you don't see as many of them because the contrast is a little bit higher, so that it doesn't render all of them at once. But if I start taking that value down, you're going to see those guys coming in more and more and more, and that's what the texture looks like. This is just to allow for you to control how many stars you have in your sky. The flicker pattern, so there's a subtractive texture passing over the the star's texture. That's what gives them kind of a little flicker. If you notice, this little guy in particular is flickering, flickering, flickering. You can control the pattern scale for that, so how many stars are being blocked out per pass, and how fast that texture is passing over to subtract from the emissive value of the stars. You can also set the star color to be, you know, whatever you want it to. It's kind of hard to notice because it's using so much emission, but like if I set it to red, you can kind of see these little red values popping up. Again, I'm not really going to mess with that. I'm going to leave that locked to the time of day just because it works. It just works. Todd Howard. The sun. You can lock the sun color to its own position. Again, that's what most things in the system derive their settings from. So we're going to bring the sun back. I'm going to bring the clouds back because I missed them. Okay, so by default, the sun is going to pull whatever color it is based on a color curve, which pulls its values through a time slot, which is actually the time for the sun, for the color curve. So you can set on the sun to pull a color based on what you decide, and you can pick it from this color picker here. Set the sun to be whatever you want. You can also set the intensity of the sun. So how bright is the sun going to be? And 188 is a crazy high value. 20 is kind of my go-to, but you can set it to whatever you want. I keep saying that. Sun indirect lighting. So if you have your engine version set up to use light propagation values, or volumes, excuse me, with fully dynamic lighting, which there is a Wikipedia tutorial on how to do that. If you just search Unreal Engine for light propagation volumes, on Google, it'll pull up a little Wikipedia article and it'll show you how to do that. It's really easy. I'm not going to go over it in this video. There's plenty of documentation out there on how to do it. So it is dependent on that. I haven't done it for 4.13. I've literally only installed 4.13 to work on Orbit, so I haven't gotten to play around with it a whole lot yet. Doesn't matter. Moving on, if you know what indirect lighting is. Sun shafts, whether or not it's going to render sun shafts from the directional light. You can turn those on or off. It's kind of hard to tell right now, but if I set this value to like 1, then it's very easy to tell whether I'm doing that. So I'm going to back up there. Okay, there we go. The sun radius, so that's going to be how big the sun disk is going to be in the sky, which that's just insanely high. That's insanely small. You get the idea. You can do the sun disk brightness itself, so without changing how bright the sun shines like on the world, like if I were to change intensity, I can change the sun disk brightness. That's not going to affect the lighting at all, but when you look at the sun, it's going to affect how bright that is when you stare at it, which you should never stare at the sun in real life. Don't do it. The sun glow brightness, so there's another mask within the sky material that has a softer fall off that serves as the sun glow without actually passing volumetrically through like the light shafts do. And it's the same thing. You set the radius for that. You can set the brightness for it, and you can set the fall off. Moving forward, we come to height fog. Actually, I'm going to skip over height fog for just a second because this daytime ambient lighting is driving me nuts. So moving forward real quick to ambient lighting. You can set whether or not to even render ambient lighting at all, but it's so dark during the day right now that it's like barely making a difference. So the ambient lighting intensity, is adjustable. I'm going to set it to like 0.5, so that's a little bit better during the day, just so that it's not super dark in the corners there. And then you tie the ambient, like how bright it is, how bright the ambient lighting is based on the sun position. The sun color is not tied, or the ambient lighting, excuse me, is not tied to the sun position because I don't have the ambient lighting color set to change. And the reason that I did that was just kind of, I didn't really have a reason for it. It didn't make sense for me to change the ambient lighting color based on the sun position at the time when I was setting it up. If everybody feels differently and I hear some feedback on it, I can definitely change that, but for now that's how it is. Anyway, I think I went over ambient lighting darkness before, but in case I didn't, that's how dark the ambient lighting is going to be at night. So if I, change the time of day, so like if I change this value right here, it's not making any, well, it's making a little bit of a difference during the day, but not nearly as much. So if I set it to like right here, it's only making a difference if I actually pass the value that it's currently at. So since it's lower, we'll say leave it at 0.2 or something like that. Then I'm going to set the time of day to nighttime. So now the ambient lighting at night is pretty bright. But if I scroll back down and lower that value again, the ambient lighting values only at night are going to be lowered. But then when I set it back to daytime again, the ambient lighting is what we left it at. And it's kind of hard to tell here. Let me move that. So yeah, those shadows are exactly what it was before. Moving forward. Lightning. Lightning's kind of tricky to go over without simulating everything. But essentially, I'll just kind of talk over it. So, lightning color is not dependent on the sun rotation. You can set the lightning color to whatever you want it to be. If you set it to that color, it's going to stay that color at runtime. Lightning brightness, how bright the actual bolts are going to be. Real quick here before I move forward. The lightning in the system is completely procedurally shaped and placed. Not in the, well, no, not in that order. Doesn't matter. So it takes a spline mesh component and aligns a cylinder mesh to it. And applies an emissive material to that mesh. And so it starts off at your cloud height. So what you set your stratus cloud height to be is where the initial bolt is going to start shaping itself, and then it's going to fire downward with probability-based, randomly selected values to offset the X and the Y values for the next dots, if you're connecting the dots, so to speak. So you can control, the lightning arc is going to control how far from the last point position is the next point position going to reach out on the X and Y values. And then the break lengths are going to be the Z, so to speak, the Z lengths between those points. It's typically better to set the lightning break lengths to be bigger, and the reason for that is that the lightning is going to keep shaping itself until it hits something. So if you set those break lengths to be really small, it's going to set up a ton of break lengths and make a very, very complex spline mesh on the fly, and it can cause system hiccups. Whereas if you set the break lengths to be longer, that means that there's going to be fewer spline points between the start point in the clouds and the hit point wherever it hits on the ground or wherever it hits. If you want to experiment and kind of figure out what the threshold is for your hardware, feel free to do so. 30,000 is kind of my go-to for my system, and it's really more of a CPU hitch, so graphics aren't necessarily as big of an issue for this. So it really kind of depends on your CPU. The lightning flicker rate, so after the mesh forms itself, or after the spline forms itself and aligns the mesh to it, it'll flicker a couple times, and that'll affect lighting on the ground where it hits. It spawns point lights, so lights up the area that it's in and casts shadows, and it also lights the clouds, which we went over a little bit earlier. It's the same as the moonlighting type stuff. So the flicker rate is how many seconds between each flicker is it going to flicker on and off, essentially. 0.01 is the go-to for me. You can also do the max number of flickers, which is defaulted to 20, which is fine. Lightning max X distance from origin and lightning max Y distance from origin. So that's not the origin, like relative to where orbit is within itself. If that makes sense, I worded that so weird. It's to world origin, so literally vector 0, 0, 0 in the world space. If you set it to 0, it's going to hit 0, 0, 0 every time. Each increment of 1 equates to 100,000 units. So that's how far, positive or negative, away from the 0, 0, 0 location in the world space that the spline is going to start forming itself. And then you can do a time between lightning strike checks. So lightning is based off of probability. You can set how long it takes. The system waits before it checks, hey, should I try and see if we can strike lightning again? The probability threshold for this is the lightning cloud density bias. It's going to check to see if the cloud density is up to a certain level, which you determine. And if it is, then it's going to fire that event to form the spline and place the lightning. And then the last portion of this, I exposed these sound parameters, but I did not include any extra sound samples. If you want to supply those yourself, you can. So the thunder for this is sort of spatialized, but not scientifically accurately. It's done based off of tiers. So say you are at a certain location in the world, and the lightning strikes at 0, 0, 0. When it strikes that hit location, it's going to feed into another single line trace by channel that's going to pull. Sorry, I thought someone was here. It's going to pull your camera location and then fire a trace off to wherever the lightning hit. And based on the length of that vector, it's going to set you up with a sound and a certain delay. So if the vector length is only like 200 meters, it's going to play the thunder near sound, which is just super pow, really close to you, loud, and it's going to happen right away. If you're like 2,000 meters away, it's going to play the thunder far, so it's kind of muffled, it's delayed a little bit before it hits your ears, and then very far is an extension of far, and just beyond a certain threshold. Those thresholds excuse me, are not set as exposed parameters, but you can hop into the blueprint if you want to change those. I can do a tutorial on that if people are questioning about it, but by default, the settings are pretty good. Most players aren't gonna, maybe they're not gonna stress test to see if your lightning spatialization is scientifically accurate. And if they do, then good for them. Moving on. This is turning out to be way longer than I wanted it to. Global wetness. So this is set automatically at runtime if you have precipitation set to happen. If you don't, or if you want to preview how it looks, you can do so, but it does require material functions. So now it's time to apply a material function. So let's apply it to, I guess, the material on the ski, which is also going to be the walls and stuff, whatever. So we're going to take this guy, and don't actually do it on the editor materials, just because it can mess with your other projects that use the editor materials if you don't have Orbit installed on it. I'm only doing this for a tutorial, so it's not really going to make much of a difference. And I'm just going to hit apply. I'm not going to save. So it's, yeah. Anyway, so hopping into this material here, we have the diffuse and the roughness. I am going to right click and search for MF for material function, snow rain. Now this is a material function that is going to apply the rain and snow buildup and culling as defined by the blueprint. So you're going to take your diffuse input and you're going to place it here, and then you're going to pass it right through from the diffuse output and put it into your base color like you normally would. Requires valid texture. It needs a texture object instead of a color. So we can go ahead and do a texture sample. And I did not set us up with any starter stuff, so we're just going to do, we're going to apply birch bark, which came with the example project. Requires valid texture. What are you talking about? Oh, there's something actually wrong with the function. Where is it? What is the problem? Here we go. Okay. Rain pattern. Why is that? Okay. Okay, so if you have this issue like I did when I launched, something may have happened with your mapping. So you just need to apply a texture. And that texture is T-Fog, which is going to be for wait, no, wait, hang on a second. Is this raindrops? Yeah, okay, I'm wrong. Excuse me. You're going to want T-dots. T-dots. This is for the raindrop generation. So if you run into this issue, this is how you can fix it. You just need to apply it there. So what I did, I just double-clicked into my MF Snow Rain. It opened it up. I navigated to raindrops, rain pattern, and this guy, and it was highlighted before. I just applied the T-dots texture to it. Good to go. Good to go now. Excuse me. We're going to take the roughness, what it normally is, apply it there, and I'm going to save. Well, I shouldn't have saved. I should have hit apply. Doesn't matter. Jeez. So I'm going to close out of that. So, hey, we have birch bark applied to everything. Cool. Okay. So now I can go into my Orbit blueprint, scroll down to weather, and apply global wetness. So as I start scaling this up, and it may be kind of tough to see on this bright of a color, but if I move myself, slow down that camera speed a little bit, and since the sun is shining right on it again, it's kind of hard to see. Excuse me. Move this down a little bit. You can see that wetness has been applied, and there's actually raindrops that fall on this. Let's see where they're at. They're a little easier to see on this one. So it's globally mapped. So if you're really looking for, there we go. So it's easier to see in a darker spot. So these raindrops are forming automatically. Moving down. So again, this is all controlled at runtime anyway, unless you want to preview how it looks. I'm going to set this back to 0, and I'm going to hop back into this material for just a second because I forgot to set something. And that something that I forgot to set is displacement. For this, I'm going to use world position offset. I had this set up because in 4.12, landscape displacement was a performance nightmare. So I set it up to use position offset instead for landscapes. You can do essentially the same thing here with world displacement if you know how to set that up. Again, there's documentation on how to do that. I'm not going to go over that in this video. You would just place your tessellation value here that you want it to be specific to this mesh for, and plug the tessellation here, and then you would just take your displacement and put it here, and you can apply a displacement map here if you need to. Anyway, moving forward, I'm going to apply that. It's going to compile shaders for a second. It is a pretty expensive function. It's a lot lower than what it started off to be, but this is definitely a very involved process. And once it's done compiling, we can take a look at the exact instruction count, 444 instructions for this. So yes, it's very expensive, but there's reasons behind it. I'm hoping that I'm thinking that the switching off of mesh distance fields and going with the render target is going to be a lot cheaper. And I'll explain why in a second once it's done compiling here. Okay, so it's done compiling. So moving back to Orbit here. Weather cover, where are we? Okay, so we went over global wetness. It's time to go over global snow depth. So I can start masking this in, and you'll start seeing on Z-flat surfaces a pattern forming, and it's kind of going to look the same as the birch bark because the birch bark's white, snow bark's white. But it's going to cover that, and then it's going to start displacing the geometry upwards for the snow. And with displacement on a cube, it's essentially just going to lift the face up. But that's the general idea for it, and you can kind of see it already being displaced here. Again, that all happens at runtime. Hang on one sec. So global wetness is a value that's going to apply how wet it's going to be in the world, and then global snow depth is going to be how much snow is covering and how deep the snow is. Those are all generated at runtime, but you can preview them this way. Okay, getting back to it. You can also set the build-up speed values. This isn't tied to seconds, this is tied to an interpolation speed, so the smaller values are going to get there faster because it's time calculated between frames. Same with weather buildup fadeaway speed, so how fast or slow your weather buildup goes away after it's done precipitating and it meets a temperature value. You can set it. Is it precipitating? So on game start, it's going to be precipitating. If not, you can set it to can it precipitate. If true, it's going to go through a bunch of probability checks to see if it can precipitate, and then it will precipitate. Otherwise, it just won't. We have the minimum cloud density for precipitation. This is similar to the lightning cloud density bias. The stratus cloud density needs to be beyond this value for it to be okay to rain. And then there's also precipitation chance based on percent, whether or not it can rain. Moving from that down to here, there's a concurrent precipitation chance. So if it's already precipitating, how likely is it to continue precipitating? Because it's going to keep checking every however many seconds you set. In this case, 3 seconds. Moving back up, you can automate the temperature based on a curve on the time of day, which pulls from the sun position. Otherwise, you can set it to manually be whatever you want it to be. You can expose these parameters for your survival game if you want to. Mainly, they're used to control whether or not it's going to rain or whether it's going to snow. So we have the daily high temp, the daily low temp, and the freezing temperature, which you can change as well if you want to move this to Celsius. This is automatically defined for Fahrenheit because I'm from America. I'm sorry. I have nothing against the metric system, against Celsius. I don't know if that's part of the metric system. I'm making myself look like a stupid American. Anyway, yeah. You can also set to print the temperature value as a debugging tool. I don't really have a whole lot of other debugging tools set up for like setting to print screen, just because none of the other stuff has really been too troublesome. The temperature hasn't really been, but it's good to just kind of monitor if you need to. Where we went over the concurrent precipitation chance, the time between precipitation checks. This is going to be the sound that plays when it rains. I only included one sample. If you want to swap that out, it's right there available for you. Weather patterns. This part I'm really excited about. So I set you up with a bunch of templates. You can do the default, which is just going to be clear day, no clouds, no nothing. You can set it to automated, which is going to automate everything. Let the system just handle everything. It simulates everything. If you have like a survival sim and you just want things to be totally emergent, this is the one for you. There's sunny, which looks a whole lot like default because it's almost exactly the same. And there's lightly cloudy, which is going to look initially like automated, except for it's not going to automate the cloud density and it's not going to automate the time of day. The only one that's going to automate cloud density and time of day is automated. The rest of them are set to what you want this to be. Overcast, we'll select that and we'll hit load. It's very important that you select the pattern that you want and then hit load. That's going to tell the system to pull these parameters and set them. So here's overcast. There's rainy, which is going to apply the global wetness as if it's raining. And then if we take a look here, I don't know, we might be able to see the raindrops. Yeah, I don't know. Obsessing over that, it doesn't matter. They're there. Excuse me. Rainy, thunderstorm, which is just going to change the parameters to allow thunder to happen a lot more frequently, which you can set. It's just, it's a template. And then snowy, which is going to apply snow. And when you start up, it'll be precipitating snow. Moving this back to default. So let's say now the custom ones. Custom ones are, I think, set to be this. Oh no, yeah, these are okay. So you guys are getting some custom testing templates that I made to make sure that the system is working right. So enjoy the green sky. That's fantastic. I'm sure you're really excited about it. It's custom 1. Let's see what custom 2 was. Yeah. Okay. So that's what I was making sure. Okay. So, say you have your settings to be, like in custom 1, you have a green sky because you're making a game with an alien planet or something like that. So you'll want to save it to a custom pattern so you can reference it for later. These custom patterns are only going to be stored on the instance of Orbit that is placed in your level. So if you're saving these patterns and then you delete your Orbit actor and save your game, your project and close it and then try and reopen it, those patterns are gone. I didn't set it up to save state to a file. If people want that later on, that's something that I can do. But for now, the main intention for Orbit is you place it and then that's the one instance of Orbit that you use in your project. Say you wanted your green sky to be on pattern 3 as well. Well, right now, pattern 3 looks normal. But I'm going to load back custom 1's stuff with the green sky, and I'm going to save it to custom 3. So I'm going to click custom 3 and save. Now, when I go to custom 2, which had the blue skies, whatever, blue skies, cool. Now I'm going to load custom 3, which I just overwrote, and it has green skies now. So you can do that for any setting in this system apart from seasons, which I'm about to get to. So everything except for seasons, weather pattern, sun intensity, moon phase, whether or not to automate stuff, all of that can be saved to these custom weather patterns and loaded later if you want to reference them. We're just going to switch this back to custom 2, I guess, because that's cool. Seasons. I'll just move through the list of features. So you can choose what season it is. By default, it's spring. You can set it to summer. You can set it to fall. And you can set it to winter. They load sequentially. You can opt in or out of seasonal color grading. So if you don't feel like having that, you can do whatever season, and it'll still change and automate seasons, but it just won't change the colors. You can set it to whether or not seasons should simulate time passage at runtime, and you can set how many days are in a season. If you want to see the differences between seasons that you set up, just set them to be like 1 day and set your day length to be super short. And then you'll be able to see the passing seasons really quickly. For a realistic survival game or something like that, you can set it to be longer. Whatever you want to do. You can set it whether or not to change the temperature scale with the seasons. So in spring you can set the temperature scale to be ×1. That's going to be
whatever temperatures, daily high and low, and the freezing temperature. Well, the freezing temperature doesn't change, but the daily high and low will be ×1. In summer, the daily high and low can be times like 1.2, so it's going to be a little bit higher. Fall can be times like 0.9, so it's just a little bit chillier, and then winter can be like times 0.5, so it's super cold. It snows. All of that can happen at runtime if you just set these parameters, and then you can also change whether or not the likelihood of precipitation is changed based on the season. So like in summer, you can set it to be much lower, than what it normally would be, versus spring, it's going to rain all the time, like don't starve. Then you can set it to be higher. And all of that can be automated, and it just counts the days that pass, and bases it off of how many days per season that you set it up to be. Moving down here, you're going to see a section called Pattern Writing, Reading, Do Not Edit. These are struct values that needed to be set to readable for me to be able to create the readable, writable weather pattern system. So they have to be set to readable. Don't mess with any of them. They don't need to be touched. If you want to reference, custom 1, 2, 3 or whatever, you can just load it from here. That's what you need to do with it. If you mess with this stuff, it's gonna overcomplicate things, and troubleshooting is gonna be a little bit more difficult than it needs to be. And I think that's all. Oh no, I need to go over volumetric lighting. Last but not least, volumetric lighting. Okay, a preface to this is that this is going to bog down system performance heavily, especially if you are using your Stratus clouds in conjunction with this. And the reason for this is that there is an incredible amount of transparency overdraw with using both of these at the same time. The volumetric lighting and fog section activates a system that will attach a mesh component to your camera location using the camera manager, and the material on it is a lit translucency material that draws shadows per vertex, and then approximates the shadows that way. So if you have a far distance with your volumetric fog and lighting, and you have ultra quality volumetric cloud settings, that means the sample counts on those are both going to be very high, and there's just going to be a ton of layers of transparency. So you have to really balance what you want. If you want to do like a cinematic shot, you can get away with a little bit more kind of performance intensive stuff like that. If you want just gameplay, you kind of want to shy away from doing too many transparency layers like that, because it's going to bog down performance on anybody's system unless they have like 4 1080s or something like that. And that's wouldn't even matter for Unreal Engine because it doesn't support SLI by default. Anyway, so I'm going to show you what it looks like. So we're going to do high and near for the distance. You can set it to far and distant. Far will still support shadows by default. Distant, you're going to have to tweak your shadow cascades to get the shadows to draw across properly. There's tutorials on how to do that. Not really necessary at this point. And this is a port of my volumetric lighting system that I already released on the marketplace. So all the features that are there, the fog texture depth, the dust brightness, everything there is the same as what's in that system already. So I'm going to activate this. You'll see it here. It's automatically applied to the Blueprint Orbit actor in the world, but as soon as runtime starts, it's gonna attach it to your camera component. So I'm gonna hit and you know what, I'm actually gonna make it a little bit more of a dramatic sun angle so that you can really tell what's going on with this. So where is, I think I passed time of day. I did. So we're gonna move this to right here. So I'm gonna hit play. Volumetric lighting is being rendered. So you can see these light shafts passing diagonally here without having the directional light actor in your view frustum. That's because it's drawing these shadows per vertex on a series of meshes stacking out from the camera location. Transparency overdraw here is going to be really high. Like I have a GTX 980 Ti. I'm going to turn on frames per second here to kind of show you performance difference. So when I hop in, I have volumetric lighting enabled and volumetric stratus clouds. I'm dropping down to like 80, 90 frames per second. Whereas if I turn volumetric lighting off, I get a solid 120 frames a second. So really, the feature's there more for cinematic purposes. If you want to use it for gameplay, you can, but you know, just be warned, it is very performance intensive. You can set the quality settings, so low, medium, high. That's going to change how many vertices are on each mesh. The higher the vertice count, the more sharp the shadows are going to look, because it's approximating the lighting per vertex. If you look at per vertex lighting, you'll see what I mean by that. And then of course lower vertex counts means it's going to be approximating over longer distances across the mesh, and it's going to look a little bit more jaggedy and square, like it's low resolution shadows. The reason that I use this is because you can't control transparent shadow resolution in Unreal Engine currently. I think they're going to be changing that when they implement the forward renderer. But for now, we have deferred, so that's not going to really do you any good. Distance is going to be how far away from the camera these meshes are going to be generated. There's 3 tiers. There's near, far, and distant. They kind of speak for themselves. Density, how thick the fog is going to be. It essentially equates to opacity. Fog texture depth, so if I activate this, and I'm going to set it to like some crazy high number, and then set the fog texture depth to 0.5, it's actually projecting a volume texture, and it's kind of hard to see at this angle, but it's essentially increasing the contrast on a fog projected texture that's projected not triplanarly, but it's actually like a volume texture. Essentially, it's just not being ray marched in a cube. It's just being projected that way along some world boundaries. So if I increase the density to like 40, so you can kind of see it here. Maybe if I change the time of day so that there's a little bit more light here. There's a bit more of a fog texture, so to speak. Like, it's not just a solid color. You can kind of see that there's differences, like spaces almost between, and that's all, like I said, projected volumetrically. There's also dust. Dust is a big performance hit just because it's masking out tiny little specks. But you can set it up to render, so it's essentially just going to be volume projecting a dust texture within the world, and I don't know if I'm really going to be able to showcase it here without setting up the level to show it really, but I have another video on my YouTube channel, if you take a look, that shows it off. Okay, that is the basics of setting up Orbit. You are good now to kind of start customizing things how you want them to be. That's really the main purpose of this system, is to set up as much customization options as possible. Again, if you have any questions, you can post on my Unreal Engine 4 forums thread. You can email me at my support email, which is contactsmallheartstudios@gmail.com. You can also find me on Skype. My username is smallheartstudios. Yeah, I guess that's it. Have fun. Thank you, everybody, for your support and patience with me getting this finished and getting it out. Yeah, anyway, enjoy. Thank you.